But the reason why comedy is such a difficult genre, in my opinion, is because even if the filmmaker watches something from early 2000s and you try to make that film in 2026,
Good luck.
people are just going to be offended. They're going to look at you and be like, what's wrong with you? And they're like, how can you find this funny? You're listening to the Real Anime Podcast, and you're also watching us on YouTube. And if you've not forgotten my name is Mohnish, and I'm here as always with my co-host
Lewis.
And thank you all for returning to this amazing podcast where we talk about films, anime, and everything in between. And today's podcast topic, we're going to be talking about the Bernie Mac masterpiece with Ashton Kutcher and the amazing, amazing Zoe Saldana, who you would know from Avatar and many other projects. And that film is, of course, Guess Who? No, that is not an offer. That is exactly what the film is called. And it is a film from the early 2000s. We are revisiting early 2000s comedy, exploring the comedy genre of today, and understanding the tips and tricks of making a comedy film, all and that and more in this podcast. So, Lewis, is Guess Who a underrated comedy film, do you think? And if so, why?
1000%, right? Guess Who for me is like one of them films where if you let's say you see Bernie Mac in any film, because I've at least seen a couple of films from him where I really can count on my fingers how many times I've seen his film. First film being Friday, Don't Be a Menace to South Central while drinking your juice in the hood. That's literally the film title. The Walking Dead, Guess Who, and and Transformers, because that's one of Monish's favorite scene where if you were to like say it out loud, he would say it out loud right now. But nevertheless, the reason why yeah, so that's the line. So the reason why, to answer your question, Monish, it's truly an underrated film because Bernie Mac himself, there's no words that needs to be said. Just having Bernie Mac in a film itself, and by the way, rest in peace to Bernie Mac himself. He left us way too early, right? It's just an underrated film because one thing I love about the film is that like it brings like the soul. He's the reason why we have the soul in the film, and he's the reason why it's like a very underrated. Because in my opinion, when doing a bit of research about this on Letterboxd, believe it or not, none of our friends that we know personally, maybe yours, Monish, you have more friends than I do, but I only have a couple of friends
on
Letterboxd, and it shows that like this is really underrated because not a lot of people know about this comedy itself. Because if I were to tell you a comedy film, if I were to tell you Rush Hour, everyone knows Rush Hour. What else is there? What other comedy films do we have out there? Let's name a few. Zoolander, or like Harold and Kumar. Oh, that's a fantastic. Mean Girls, White Chicks. That's another one. So these, when we say the word comedy, Guess Who doesn't come into your mind? What do you think about that, Monish? Like, Guess Who? Yes, it doesn't. What makes you think about that? Why is it like very underrated?
I think because, to be fair, it's not really a reflection of quality. I think also because Guess Who tends to be used as a very familiar like format of comedy. We've all seen the fish out of water story where the future son-in-law visits his future father-in-law and future mother-in-law, and it's that normal kind of story that I think is very common. But also, we have to understand that the early 2000s was a pretty big golden age for comedy, so it was tough competition back then. You can't compete with the Rush Hours, Harold and Kumar, which is my personal favorite, and Zoolander, Mean Girls, all these amazing films. There was a huge amount of competition, and I think Guess Who became underrated because there's so much choice in the early 2000s about what Guess Who can really bring to the table. So I think that's why I feel it's underrated. But yeah, Lewis, anything to add?
I was going to say, because obviously the film actually, Guess Who, is actually a remake of the film which came back in 1967. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. Now, this was obviously a film directed by Stanley Kramer himself, and it's like basically just like a remake from last time itself to made into Guess Who in 2005. So in a way, you could say that like yes, it's quite common to have like those like films which regards like in-laws, like meeting your in-laws for the first time ever, having that really difficult father. You're right, but some might say that this film itself back in the 1960s, if you were to, let's be honest, if you were to compare 1960s to 2005 in terms of like the outreach and the bunch of ideas that you have in films itself. Obviously, maybe you could correct me if I'm wrong. When we reach the early 21st century, you probably have like 10 films which kind of follows like the in-law, let's just call it like the meeting the father-in-law sort of film type, if you get what I mean.
Yeah, and actually, just to add on to that point, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner was in 1967 and stars Sidney Poitier, who was basically the trailblazer for black actors. And I think now that I think we've illustrated that point, I actually kind of understand a lot more of why Guess Who is underrated, because Guess Who's Coming to Dinner is an Oscar-winning film, and Sidney Poitier changed the landscape for black actors by winning his Oscar in that film. And that film's actually a lot more, even though it's listed as a comedy drama, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner is one of the most serious, dramatic achievements, I think, because it shows Sidney Poitier's performance, but it also shows about how a certain family's prejudice can get in the way of love and moving forward. And it's actually a lot more of a serious drama than it is than Bernie Mac's Guess Who would be. So I think maybe the reason it's underrated and it's not even a 50% rated film on Metacritic is that it has its low ratings because of that. Not to say that Guess Who's Coming to Dinner is at fault, but Guess Who's Coming to Dinner is a classic, timeless movie, and I think by comparison, maybe Guess Who by Bernie Mac, starring Bernie Mac, looks like the cheap short film that nobody wanted to see. So, like, I enjoyed the film by Bernie Mac. I also enjoyed Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. It's just that when you have an Oscar-winning film that is so symbolic, and I think won the black actor who was Sidney Poitier at the time, his first or second Oscar, I believe, and that really changed the landscape. So I feel like Guess Who was sort of destined to be underrated, but hopefully more people watch it and discover it. I already can see cinema purists are not going to enjoy it because they'll be comparing it instantly to Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, which is probably a mistake in my opinion because they're two different films at this point. I wouldn't even classify them as a remake because Guess Who and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner is just way too far apart now at this point, and Bernie Mac's comedic genius is definitely shining, but he cannot compete with Sidney Poitier's dramatic acting, so I think it's a bit unfair to compare the two pieces, but I prefer to view them as two different films, and I just don't understand sometimes maybe like why Guess Who is so poorly reviewed. It doesn't even have 50%. It's not even half, so I feel like it's a very unfortunate milestone for the film, which I feel like is a bit harsh actually. I would have given it at least 70% because I quite enjoyed the film, but it's just plain to see that the world doesn't really rate it highly. But yeah.
Yeah, I certainly agree with you. I mean, this is a perfect film where you should never judge a book by its cover. Unless you're watching Rebel Moon, that one, you definitely judge a book by its cover. Been a while since I last said that. But nevertheless, it's a perfect film, and don't let like the critics or like the Rotten Tomatoes scores. I think on Rotten Tomatoes or Metacritic it was 41%. One of them I can't
yeah,
remember.
like it's so underrated to the point even Rotten Tomatoes doesn't have enough reviews on it.
Yeah, it's a bit sad, but nevertheless, I mean, it kind of brings us to the next discussion in a way, because like when creating a comedy film is very difficult, as you can see with Guess Who, is part of the genre comedy, and doing any comedy film doing any comedy film is just a tough code to crack. And why does it? And it's very difficult. Like let's take me for example. I've directed at least how many comedy films? At least I think just one as of now, probably. The other films were more like serious drama, thrillers and stuff like that. And it's something I could relate to like how difficult it is to make a comedy film also, with one coming soon as of time of recording this. And then it's certainly like a really difficult genre to create, because like you as a script writer, right, Mohnish, maybe you could give us a bit of an insight also. How do you even make a person laugh when it's written on a piece of paper? And writing on a piece of paper is not the same as portraying it. Show, not tell. Show and tell.
I mean, the thing is, it's also, I still think, okay, on just that small point, I still think it is show, not tell, because you do need to let the person's imagination do the work for them. But on the wider topic of why comedy is such a difficult genre to take on as a filmmaker, it's really down to the fact that comedy is the one genre, and that I believe in mainstream cinema, that is the most difficult to adjust to, because it changes every few years. Horror also changes every few years, and these are where the parallels start between horror and comedy. You can call them two sides of the same coin, because horror and comedy have this thing where comedy you need to make people laugh, and horror you need to scare people, right? And what makes people laugh in 2010 is offensive to people in 2020.
Oh yes.
What makes people laugh in 2010 is offensive to people in 2000, and what makes people laugh in 1970 is offensive to people in 2005. So the problem with comedy as a genre, in my opinion, is that the society is growing. You know what I mean? They're changing. Their tastes change. You don't go to the same restaurant every month because it serves the same food, but now you sort of don't like the food as much. And the problem with comedy, which is also part of the reason why I've never fully tackled it as a filmmaker, my first film, Diary of a Hungry Man, did have moments of comedy, but it was not intentional, which I think is what made it work. But the reason why comedy is such a difficult genre, in my opinion, is because even if the filmmaker watches something from early 2000s and you try to make that film in 2026,
Good luck.
people are just going to be offended. You know, they're going to look at you and be like, what's wrong with you? And they're like, how can you find this funny? You know? And I think that the idea that comedy has so many different societal expectations is part of what makes it a difficult genre. Because when you have that level of scrutiny, that or possible scrutiny, if you offend someone by accident or by intention, you know, it can really negatively affect your film. And just to cap it off, I think that horror also has to adapt because people are not going to be scared of the same thing every time. And horror, the only difference is it offers two different avenues. It offers either you go back to classic horror and give it a different new spin, like Obsession, or you try something experimental like Backrooms, where you're able to bring more of a different take to horror than it would normally be. With comedy, the most experimental you can look at is probably the Jackass films. But even that, also, those guys are not having children after what they go through. You know what I mean? Like, physically, it must be irreversible to those guys. And the only reason Happy Gilmore had a sequel is because you have Bad Bunny cameoing, Adam Sandler is still a very popular guy, and you have a lot of other well-known people in there, right? And everyone also collectively agrees Rush Hour 3 is the worst out of the three films. So when you look at it, it is a evolution of the fact that the early 2000 shows, or in Rush Hour's case, it was late 90s, they cannot sustain the evolution of what people find funny, you know? Because that's part of also why I'm very worried about Rush Hour 4, because I just don't know if we should go ahead and do that. It's like, you can't make the same Rush Hour, you know? Like, if Jackie Chan says to Chris Tucker, go back to Africa, he's going to get cancelled. Or at least there's going to be someone saying that they should cancel him. And if Chris Tucker talks some shit about Chinese food or China, like or he does something with the eyes or whatever, you think he's not going to get cancelled? He's going to get destroyed. And even though this is a comedy action film, I don't know how they're going to take it, unless you want Jackie Chan and Chris Tucker to go around saying no cap and this and this and that, which I'm not watching if that's what's happening. Yeah, and I also actually stumbled on a quick little interview of John Cho, where he actually stars in one of my favorite comedy films, Harold and Kumar, and he was talking about like his projects, and the interviewer asked him, why isn't there another Harold and Kumar? He plain and simple said, we can't do another one. Everyone wants to do another one, but if we do it, we're all getting cancelled. So that's why I think comedy is such a difficult genre to take on as a filmmaker, because the moment you try, you're already offending somebody. And even though that's not your intention, there's always going to be someone who's going to be offended. And that's the reason why comedians in the arts right now fail a lot, because they can say one good joke and then all it takes is for one of their jokes to go viral for the wrong reasons. Their career is over completely. You'll never see them on stage again, or they'll be in jail. And comedy filmmakers have unfortunately got a similar battle to fight, because all they have to do is come up with a comedy film that offends a certain amount of people and their career is done. So I think that's such a difficult genre to handle, because ultimately, if you're not offending one or two people, you know, the comedy is not going to be 100% there. So really, we have to look at what we can do to try and sustain great comedy. But I believe comedy should be an evolving genre. You know, unfortunately, it has to maybe try and evolve with taste.
And for me personally, I'm still an old school guy at heart. The music I listen to is still old school. I don't even know who is Kanye West. I don't even know this Khalid DJ fella. I know The Weeknd. I know it's Saturday and Sunday. But then there's this fella who takes out one E in his name for The Weeknd and it becomes two E's in The Weeknd, which I don't get. But I'll give him credit. He has a nice voice, that fella. It's just like, I still live by like the old school style, and it's the best era I grew up in, you know? Like, I can't, you know, like watching films, listening to music from that time, it was just the best time of my life. And overall, to close off this topic, comedy itself is very tough to, you know, change and like always constantly come up with new ideas is because of the fact that we're living in a social media environment where every Tom, Dick, and Harry, or let's just say a majority of Tom, Dick, and Harrys in this world, has a smartphone. It's so easy with the palm of your hand. Just go on the internet, start something controversial, and before you know it, boom, that guy is gone already. When it comes to comedy, it's a very tough, sensitive topic to handle, let's just say.
Yeah, for sure. Comedy does have a way of rubbing everybody's sensitivities the wrong way or the right way. It depends on how good or bad it is. But to move on to our next topic, it's a little bit more of a blunt topic because this is pretty a straightforward question, which is why don't comedy films win awards? Now, before we get into exploring that topic, I just want to give people a little bit more of a context to this topic because the most awarded comedy is actually gone all the way back to 1934, where the film is called It Happened One Night, and it made history at the Oscars by winning the Big Five, which is Best Screenplay, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Picture. It won 5 Oscars, which is unheard of for a comedy film. Even if you're nominated as a comedy film already, it's a job well done to you. You've done almost what most comedy filmmakers in their entire life cannot do, And a more recent, when I say more recent, would be probably Woody Allen. But then the thing is, Woody Allen, his film Annie Hall won 4 Oscars. But the thing is, it's more of a rom-com, whereas It Happened One Night is more of a comedy drama. So it's the closest that we're going to get to a full-blown comedy winning. That's why I want to just talk about that, because Annie Hall was in 1977 and It Just Happened One Night is in 1934. There's never been a film in the 2000s that is a full-blown comedy that has ever been taken seriously at an award ceremony, ever. And it is, it's for a plethora of reasons. Horror also used to have this problem. But the difference between horror and comedy is horror people take seriously. People actually look at them and be like, oh wow, that actor is really good. Because you can see in horror, there's a lot of things where you have to go from a normal life to some crazy scenario and this person is screaming, shouting, crying. You get a full range of the actor's ability. So a horror film is a great way for a filmmaker to get eyes on his project or her project, and for an actor to show the full range of what they're able to capably do. So it becomes like a calling card for them, and then they get signed to a superhero movie or something, and they'll do their thing. But now horror, as of 2026, is becoming a lot more pronounced. Even in 2025, with Sinners winning its Oscars, horror is beginning to return to the awards as it is. But comedy has always been seen as has never been awarded those kinds of accolades, not once. And even looking back at 1934, which neither our parents or us were born, and then in 1977, which neither me or Lewis were born, was the last time you can say any film with a real comedic flair to it had any interest or inkling of being in relation to an award.
Comedy should deserve to have a voice, because you already have awards for all these best comedians also from around the world. Because I remember our local comedian Haris Iskandar actually won an award beating some famous comedians around the world. But however, why can't we have that for film? Because let's be honest, you can't be watching too much of horror, because if you watch too much of horror you might get nightmares, or it messes up with your mental side. If you watch too much of drama, you're gonna cry too much. Romance, you're gonna cry too much. Why can't we have a separate standalone award for comedy itself? Now, yes, you might make a case saying if you take Hangover, for example, it's just these 3 grown men, like one of the films they go to Bangkok. I remember, I think that's the second film. They go to Bangkok, they get absolutely wasted, and then Doug loses his tooth, and then Alan basically goes literally goes bald. Then yes, people would think oh yeah, it's just a bunch of lads on holiday, stuff like that. Another Lads on Holiday film, which was made from a TV series also. First time it's making its debut is The In-Betweeners. I love that show. It's from England itself. That too is another good comedy series, but the film itself, the first one was good, second film was a bit not so good. But I guess the reason why, to answer your question, why comedy films does not really win an award, my theory could also be, one of it could be budget also. Now yes, some comedy films will have big budgets, of course. However, if we were to compare it to let's take a Christopher Nolan film, for example. The previous film, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it had over 200 million USD dollars in terms of budget, I think, for the Odyssey. And that's already now everyone's talking about the film. And I know, yes, the film recently came out, but you can also make an argument saying that if your film has a higher budget, and depending how you use it, don't be like maybe Chelsea who spends like 1 billion in like 5 years or something like that. I mean, if you do, at least buy on quality players. But now no, Chelsea are planning to get Jordan Henderson and stuff like that. But that's a topic for another day. Like I think my theory could be that, like, number one, comedy is not taken seriously, and it's not meant to be taken seriously, by the way. Number two, another topic could be for like maybe the budget. Maybe it's just because of budget. Because let's say if you were to make like an action film, for example, take like Mission Impossible, for example, you have like these very high budgets where you could do like crazy stuff, like Tom Cruise just like go like, you know, holding on the side of the aeroplane, or him just like riding a motorbike, all these sort of things, which makes people go like, wow. Bad Boys, for example, is another one.
So
Yeah.
so basically, like, to sum up your point, it's basically that there's not enough budget to create a wow factor. Is that what you're saying?
It could be, it's one of my points, certainly, for sure.
Okay, like, I just want to add on to that, sort of to give a more constructive discussion. I feel because one of the Oscar winners in 2016, Moonlight, was made for $1.5 million. That is significantly cheaper than some of the best comedy films made today, significantly, and it's an Oscar-winning film. And what if Obsession starts to win Oscars? 750,000. It's a horror and comedy are notoriously the lower budget projects. Those are the projects that thrive on lower budgets. And you've seen high budget comedies. Would you say Happy Gilmore 2 is better than Rush Hour 1?
No, but I think the high budget for Happy Gilmore 2 probably goes to the actors, probably the actor's salary. But if you're talking about a high budget for comedy, maybe for like added props or added stuff, maybe you can make a case for that, not for the actors.
Okay, so then I'm going to use horror and comedy as an example here.
Go ahead.
Okay, so horror typically wins a lot for
Maybe sound.
the way the the actors. I mean, the
Okay,
actors tend to get a lot of the praise because of their performance, right? Now, we've just been talking about Bernie Mac in Guess Who, and Bernie Mac, of course, he carries the comedy in that film, yeah. And so if he's carrying the comedy in that film, most of the money should go to him. That's like saying giving Jim Carrey in Ace Ventura, which is another great comedy film franchise that I wish would come back, but there's no chance that that's coming back because that's going to send someone to jail. That's like saying Jim Carrey shouldn't get the highest salary because he literally is the reason we are laughing, you know? So I feel like, okay, I understand your point about budget, but at some point you're just going to have to find an actor who can be funny, you know? Not necessarily a stand-up comedian, but like Jim Carrey is not a stand-up comedian by trade anymore. He's an actor, but he was, you know. Bernie Mac, of course, I believe continued his thing. Robin Williams was one of the most successful comedy actors, considering he had this unbelievable ability to improv. And he made every film he did a Robin Williams film, even though he was acting alongside people like Robert De Niro in Awakenings, or, you know, he was acting aside in a Christopher Nolan film he acted in called Insomnia with Al Pacino, which was not a comedy. So it shows his range, right? And I think that's where comedy and horror intersect, because you have actors that should be able to have that level of range. Like even Adam Sandler did a serious film called Uncut Gems with the Safdie brothers, and it showed his range. Obviously, his bread and butter is in comedy, but if the film is average, like Rush Hour 3 versus Rush Hour 1 is not even a competition for me, you know? But Rush Hour 3 is a good film, but even Jackie Chan and Chris Tucker said they had too much money and too much time. Literally, they said they had too much money and too much time. So I think we can surmise that money is not exactly the issue here. I think it's also the level of creativity that our industry is allowing, you know? And I say that only because of the current social climate. Like you said, Luis, you are a fan of the early 2000s comedy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. No chance those films get made these days. No chance.
Nope.
And if anyone made those films today, it's either they're going to get cancelled or going to jail. So how are you, as a comedy director, going to try and bridge that gap? Because you can't really tell the story you want to tell or that you love or inspired you. So how are you going to bridge that gap, you know?
Well, I mean, I can tell you from experience from Lost Memories also. This is like, basically, let's consider it as like mini advice for the future filmmakers or anyone who's looking to do comedy itself. I mean, like, yes, we have to take into consideration that, like, we can't please everyone, fine. And there'll be like minorities saying like this and that about the film. It's normal, we can't please anyone. Like what you and I, like Mohnish, we can't please like someone next to us, right?
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I actually like the point you're going on. I just want to make the point that even though you cannot please everyone, the fact that you piss off the wrong people can put you in jail.
100%.
So it's not just opinion anymore, you know what I mean? Yeah, people may not like your film, okay lah, no problem. But your film literally puts your life in danger if you succeed. at telling the film that you want to tell.
Yeah, it's
So yeah,
it's a bit of a risk, actually, high risk also. However, for me, like when creating a comedy film, yes, I want to make sure that when creating a comedy film, I don't include things which are like, racist jokes, for example, or like any negative stereotypes, or like being like saying bad thing about a community, all these sort of things. And I want it, and for me personally, I want to make my comedy in a way where it's like relatable, for like trying to make it as raw as possible, but not raw to the point where it kind of like gets you cancelled, but
yeah.
raw in a way where it's just like, just think of it as just like, we're not going to talk about hangover levels. That one's a bit too too high of a level in terms of comedy, or like guys getting drunk or whatnot. But I like to think of it as like the country we live in, Malaysia, for example, like all these like sort of like comedic traits that we can take and all of us can relate to, for example, right? So that's how I kind of like think of, like, maybe I think of like how I think of an example of how to, maybe my advice to think of like a comedy film itself. I think of society, on how, society will relate to like all these like sort of comedic situations. Because let's be honest, if we don't laugh, what are we doing with our life?
Yeah, it's not that I'm saying we don't laugh. It's just unfortunately we are laughing at different things now.
Yeah.
No longer, the audience is no longer interested in the early 2000s, let's say. Maybe you and me, our generation is, yes, but the younger generation, they look at this and they find it offensive.
Yep.
You know what I
100%.
mean? 100% offensive. And if you look at it, you're like, oh my god, why is this such an offensive film? Like you said, you didn't want to include negative stereotypes in your film, right? But you also said you wanted it to be relatable. Aren't negative stereotypes also the most relatable
It
things?
is.
Because,
Yeah.
like, for example, we use Guess Who as an example, right? Don't you think, from Ashton Kutcher's perspective, his character's perspective, that Bernie Mac is being racist to him?
Yeah. If you were to look at it from a film theory point of
Yeah.
view, yes, you are right. Correct.
Not film theory, it's just
Yeah.
basic math. He's black, he's white, and the guy said, what? You didn't tell me he's white? You know what I mean? It's like you're in an Indian family and you bring home a Chinese girlfriend. It's like, whoa, hold on. Like, don't get me wrong. The reaction in Indian family will be like, hey, well done, lah, well done, well done. Like, it's a whole different reaction. But the point is, the judgment is being made based on his or her race. So that is in itself a negative stereotype, which therefore made the film relatable. So the negative stereotype is unfortunately the byproduct of being relatable. You know what I mean? Unless you're going to go down the route of, the skibidi cup up, or the no cap this cat, or whatever. I mean, I don't really get that humor, in my opinion, but maybe I'm just old. So the problem with comedy is we age out. That's the issue.
That's true.
If we made this film when we were 16 years old, people probably be like, oh, you know what, that's so nostalgic. Probably can't do that more and more, but nostalgic. Make it now, you're risking a reaction that you're not intending. Let's just put it that way, right? But of course, there are many other versions. Like, before we get into the final moment of finishing off this podcast, which, as you know, is our letterbox review, I just want to add on that there are a lot of ways to, in terms of advice on how you'd make a great comedy film, there are a lot of ways to make a great comedy film stick. Like Guess Who isn't just fully a comedy film. There is actual drama there. There's actual romance in some moments, but I feel like it's more of a comedy drama, in my opinion. So Bernie Mac brings the comedy, and of course, you have that moment where Bernie Mac and Ashton Kutcher's characters, they mess up, and the ladies, mother and daughter, just chow and leave them there and let them suffer and whatnot. But then there's that moment where Bernie Mac goes to get Ashton Kutcher back, right? And it's all like very dramatic, because he's like, man, you should try harder, just because she said no, maybe go and try and tell her how you feel, and it's actually a serious emotional moment. So I feel like the greatest comedies weave in serious moments to give their film the emotional impact it needs. Because if everybody is just laughing, the moment the credits roll and they stop laughing, they forget your film. But if you include one serious message in your comedy that everybody can be like, oh, you know what, that actually, I really feel that, then even though they were laughing the whole time, they might cry at the end, So at least if you give people a strong enough emotional experience, I do believe you can make a great comedy film.
100%. That's why you watch Lost Memories, because it does
There you
tackle
go.
a bit on like things such as like the form of like how mental health, for example, where it's just like from the outside the fellow looks happy, but inside you don't know what's he like. And I'm not going to spoil the ending for you guys who've not watched it yet, but that's one of the things that Mohnish says, like, yes, comedy, if you want to have like those like sort of like, the typical uncle stories, or like back in uncle's day, like those sort of things, please go ahead. However, you
Yeah.
want to have that substance where it's like balance it out with each other lah.
Yeah, I mean, there is a just before we end it to the letterbox reviews, there is actually a genre of comedy called screwball comedy that is definitely taking the world by storm now. Where it actually came out in the genre actually came out in the Great Depression time, but recently we've had a screwball comedy win the Oscar Best Picture, which was Anora. So Anora, so screwball comedy, that type of comedy is actually more chaotic, and it feels a lot more like the Battle of the Sexes, and you have like the dominant female character, or a lot of rapid fire dialogue, or you have a lot of unexpected action. And I do believe Sean Baker actually made that on a very low budget as well, shooting with his cameras and iPhone and stuff like that. So there is a place for comedy, but the type of comedy that will win awards is no longer the early 2000s. While I love early 2000s comedy, it's time to say goodbye. But on that note, let's go now to our letterbox reviews. Lewis and I are probably the only two people on Letterbox that we know who have seen this film and reviewed it. So I will, of course, be reading Lewis's review, and he will be reading my review. So
Yep.
that's gonna be fun.
Let's do it. So Mohnish over here watched it on 25th of July 2026. So he gave it 4 stars, and it goes like this. Bernie Mac is one of comedy's brightest lights, and this film blends that bright light into a heartfelt comedy that isn't shy to tug at your heartstrings with serious emotional moments, a musical number, and of course, that classical Bernie Mac flavor that makes it all work. This is not a recipe, but these people cooked. P.S. This film was the inspo for Get Out. I'm sure of it. Once again, comedy and horror, I see you. What Monish said is totally right. Bernie Mac, like I said in the start of the podcast, heart and soul of the film. Without him, it's quite tough to like get like a character like Bernie Mac. I know, yes, you have tons of like comedians like him, or tons of actors like Jim Carrey or the late Robin Williams, which, by the way, rest in peace to him also. He left us, I think, just over 12 years ago. Can you believe that? I'm like, wow, that was a while ago. There are other people like Bernie Mac, like him, but I think it's just something with Bernie Mac. It's just his personality just brings it all.
Now, I will be reading Lewis's review on Guess Who, which he rewatched on the 29th of July, also giving it 4 stars. And his review goes a little something like this. Bernie Mac, a man who left us too soon. His presence and his humor are what made these heartfelt moments into a film, where you can take your mind off things and have a good laugh. Ashton Kutcher tries to impress Bernie Mac, trying to outdo each other, going from enemies to best friends. It just adds to the credit to the characters' personalities, which adds to the film's replayability. You mean rewatchability, but
Yep.
I understand.
Yep.
And it actually, I agree with him. This film is extremely rewatchable. It has such a great lightness to it. I just wish people wouldn't compare this to Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, because let's be honest, it's just 2 different films. But aside from that point, Bernie Mac is the absolute godla in this film. Loved him to death. Absolutely amazing. Also a great review from Lewis here, so do go check him out on Letterbox for more fire reviews. Lewis, how many films have you got on Letterbox reviewed so far?
I think it's close to 50 now, actually.
Wow, close to 50. Look at our boy growing. Man's crying already. But aside from that, now we'll move on to the next review, which I believe, Lewis, you can read it. This is by Milos.
Okay, so Milos over here gave this 3.5 stars and watched this on 26th of November 2023. Even though Meet the Parents 2000 has already been done, it's still an enjoyable and fun light comedy film to watch on Sunday night. I enjoyed the performances by Ashton Kutcher and Bernie Mac as their characters feuded throughout the story. Bernie Mac, heart and soul, and Ashton Kutcher was that perfect kind of like contrast, or like that yang that needed to that sort of actor you needed to have, especially with a big personality like Bernie Mac, to help like balance out the book itself.
Now, moving on to our next and final review by Morg.
Very long review.
Who has a very long review, basically an essay. Also, this one has 3 stars, where he watched it on the 8th of May 2023, and his essay starts off like this. Remake it with Ice Cube and Timothée Chalamet. Just like that, 545 likes. So, Hollywood, if you're listening, Ice Cube and Timothée Chalamet, don't think it'll be as good of a remake, but it'll be bloody high budget with Timothée Chalamet, so... And that, ladies and gentlemen, is our podcast on Guess Who. And of course, we've been talking about the comedy genre, so a lot of insights on that from our resident comedy director, Lewis, over here. Do check out Lost Memories, currently on the Filmmakers YouTube channel. And of course, he has Lost Answers coming out soon, so do check that out when it does drop. And thank you all so much for listening. Thank you all so much for watching. We are delighted to once again be your host for this, and we will see you in the next one.